It's a real privilege for me to introduce the next speaker. However, I don't have my eyeglasses, and there's no way I can read the font of his very detailed bio. But I can basically tell you that Dr. Scott Pace has done it all. From his time at NASA, his leadership there, from the RAND Corporation, and also as well, and most importantly, his last position as running the Space Policy Institute, combined with the entire background that he's had, made him infinitely qualified. And I can say when, for his current position, and I can say when the idea of the National Space Council was kicked around during the campaign, the 2016 presidential campaign, and the president made a pledge to bring on a National Space Council, the collective applause from our industry when we heard that Dr. Scott Pace would be the executive secretary was almost as deafening as the applause last night in National Stadium with the Nationals loss. So that's the same parallel that you are on, Scott, that you are a champion of Washington, D.C., in the space community. So Scott has led the National Space Council, the executive secretary of the National Space Council now for about 2 years or 2.5 years. It probably feels like 8 or so. And I say that because I'll share a quick story with you. As last week, as I mentioned, with the International Astronautical Congress in town, many events, space leaders from around the world, and everyone wanted to meet with Scott, and I know Scott availed himself and his time to them tremendously at various receptions. I was at one reception with Scott at the State Department, and a few of my colleagues and I went out to another one. We were walking back, and I don't even know what time of night it was, but it was close to the 11 o'clock hour as I'm walking past the old executive office building, and Scott was just leaving. And instead of just letting the poor man, walk home and get 4 hours of sleep before he got into, I took him down for about 15 minutes on some of the geopolitical issues that are surrounding the space industry. With the National Space Council, as Scott will mention and talk about today, he's also got a user advisory group, which I still owe him for helping me, tremendously owe him for helping me get on that position so we can get the ideas and the issues of the commercial space industry, but also the aviation community as a whole in front of the National Space Council. So with that, it's my real privilege, as I said, to introduce Dr. Scott Pace, the Executive Secretary of the National Space Council. Scott.
Well, thank you, Eric. It's very kind, and of course, it's only downhill from here after that introduction. Right, set the bar high. So first of all, I really want to thank you all for having this the event today. I realize I'm the closing keynote, so I'm between you and dinner and drinks. So I'll try to be brief and hopefully and build in some time to really just take questions. And I have to start off by saying that on behalf of the President and the Vice President and the rest of the National Space Council members, I really want to thank the Commercial Spaceflight Federation and the Airline Pilots Association for hosting this unique event today. As a form of full disclosure, I am not a licensed pilot, so I know that puts me in a lesser category of human than else. But my claim is that my late father-in-law was a pilot who started off flying Curtiss Wright 46s, flew Hurricanes out of Scotland during World War II, retired as a 747 cargo captain, flew everything else in between. And one of the things he was really proudest of in several places that he worked, some of you might remember Seaboard World Air, before it became topped by Flying Tigers and so forth, was his safety record. He was chief safety pilot on Seaboard and was proud of having 0 fatal accidents on his watch, even while he did a number of fairly dangerous things during his lifetime. So the issue of flying safely, of always paying attention to the aircraft, of being a little wary of automation, which sometimes adds work when you don't need more work and takes away work when you should be maybe doing something and not going to sleep. All these issues I certainly remember from him. In President Trump's first year of office, he revived the National Space Council. This is really its third major incarnation. You can look back as to what happened in the early space race period when President Kennedy took the council that had been created by Eisenhower and had Lyndon Johnson become the first chairman of it to kind of signify its importance. It went into disuse in the later Johnson administration, and Nixon wound up disbanding it. It came back under Bush 41 in a very, very different environment where we were just at the end of the Cold War. I was at the Commerce Department in the Office of Space Commerce, which is, again, back in the news today. And we were dealing with a lot of dual use issues. Dual use meaning things that we really would never have dealt with during the Cold War, things like entry of Russia, China, Ukraine into the international launch market, what to do with lots of excess ballistic missiles, high-resolution remote sensing imagery that previously would have been classified now being provided by commercial providers. So that kind of is what dealt with that period. So this third reincarnation of the Space Council deals with a different set of issues, of course, than the prior two. The world we're in today is one of, you might call democratization, where there are many, many more countries that are capable of operating in space, and there are many, many more companies that are capable of operating in space. Back in Bush 41, when I wanted sort of innovative ideas, to go out, might go to the national labs, Lawrence Livermore or something like that, I don't have to look very far. I just have to open a copy of Space News and I can find tons of innovative ideas. We have a much more robust commercial industry, both domestically and globally, than we ever did before. And so our challenge today is how do we manage that reality of a much more crowded environment, a much more diverse environment. So last year, President Trump signed Space Policy Directive 2, which implemented a National Space Council program of regulatory reform regulations that were designed to transform the licensing regimes that oversee launch, reentry, and new commercial operations in space. There's also others that dealt with export controls and remote sensing, but of course, I think what's of most interest are the launch regulations. And as with the commercial remote sensing regulations, the main characteristic is that these older regulations were just drastically old. They, in fact, it's not just a matter of streamlining. In many cases, it's a matter of creating new enabling regulations to deal with things that didn't exist before, reusable rockets operating out of both coasts, a higher launch rate than ever sort of seen before. Many of the issues coming up with the regulations don't deal with the problems of, gee, what does it mean to be safe, or how do I fly the rocket correctly? It deals with how much we need to do, how often we need to fly. Just as one example, which maybe somebody will tell me it's been solved, but last I checked it wasn't, in some cases for flight termination systems, we wind up using frequencies that we need special temporary authorizations from the FCC to do. And when you're only flying a few a year, okay, that's not bad, you can take your time. If you're flying dozens of flights per year, the FCC is going to frown on you using those STAs. That's not the way they're supposed to be used. And so as you get toward those higher flight rates, you have problems with regulatory authorities other than the FAA. So another answer is, well, do I get a permanent primary allocation for this function? Now you're into the whole radio frequency fight, which is a whole other issue. Or you wind up saying, why do I need to move to new technology? Move to, say, GPS devices that do metric tracking. I move away from C-band radars. I have autonomous flight termination systems, and I don't need to use that system. So there's a tension between how fast do I adopt new technologies, or how much pain and suffering do I want to take in the regulatory process, given the fact that I've got this market which is moving, I've got this flight rate which is changing far beyond what the original regulations were designed to handle. Now, obviously, we're streamlining these regulations to focus fundamentally on safety. Now, of course, you can always go to an extreme and not fly at all, and then you're 100% safe. Well, that's not really helpful. But we need to be safe in order to have the acceptance not only of customers, but also really of the American public. Rocketry is different. Now, the airline industry, of course, has a magnificent safety record that I think it will be some time before the rocketry business comes close to that the airlines have established. But nonetheless, if we're going to have the sort of public acceptance of flights, then we need to have safety in our launch systems as well, not only for the customers, but for also uninvolved third parties on the ground. Now, the Space Policy Directive 2 directed the department through FAA to begin this licensing process, and we're in the middle of that now. Shall we say it has attracted intense interest, so there are tons of commentary that have come in, and again, I don't need to recapitulate that for you. But I will say what the Vice President said on the signing of SPD 2, when he said, quote, "This directive will encourage American leadership in space commerce by creating more certainty for investors and private industry. while focusing on protecting our national security and public safety, unquote. Now, adjudication of the public feedback we've gotten so far to the proposed rule is ongoing, and we're hoping for a final rule to be targeted by the release later next year. This has gotten into kind of a rhythm now, so FAA is routinely letting us know how they're doing, and this has White House attention because, of course, it's a highly visible activity. And we're hoping that with the kind of very extensive and thoughtful comments that have been provided so far, there's enough meat available for the regulators to work with, and we think there are. Now, the overall commercial space industry that's enabled by launch is particularly exciting. You've heard about this incredible growth across the globe. First year, we've seen almost as much invested in space companies as we did in the entire year before, with nearly $25 billion invested in about 500 different space companies over the last decade, the majority of which have been in American businesses. So America continues to be the place to do business. The U.S. government is ready to do its part. We recently released a memo on the FY21 R&D budget priorities for American space exploration, and we included a line about departments and agencies should prioritize activities that ensure the industrial base for commercial activity in space that will broadly speed private sector progress in meeting stated government goals and furthering the space economy. So as you might imagine, for the government, this is actually somewhat self-interested. The more the industry prospers, the more it is able to lower costs, the more it is able to offer innovative solutions, the more we're able to perform our public missions better and faster and with more savings to the taxpayer. Now, I'm going to steal a little thunder and use a quote from my former boss, who's now the Undersecretary of Defense for R&E, Mike Griffin. And he said, looking beyond just our economy, it says, to disrupt our adversaries' calculus in the space domain and deter aggression, we must first disrupt our own space community's risk-adverse culture by relearning how to build, deploy, operate, innovate rapidly and at low cost. And we can have a long discussion about Space Development Agency and DARPA and other things that are doing that. But again, the theme that keeps coming up again is, why is this period different than other periods? Other periods had innovation, other periods had technical breakthrough. What's different about this period is the speed at which activities are going on. So looking to, I know some of the work that SpaceX has been doing on Starlink, some of the work OneWeb has been doing. We're talking about factories producing satellites as opposed to, handcrafted artisanal products. We're talking about mass production sorts of items. Launches, instead of being science fair projects that go on for many months, we're looking to have ones that have routine access to space, and the word on routine I know has been over-abused over the years, but literally trying to get toward that kind of routine access. That is a very, very different level of operations. You start getting into statistics where those of you who've done total quality management, Lean Six Sigma, you start having enough numbers that it starts to be actually relevant. Again, a very different kind of environment than what we've had for many decades, where the focus has been on sort of individually crafted scientific and technical solutions. So we're in a different environment. Now, this has implications not only for our economy, but also what we are up against internationally. Now, we have a different geopolitical situation today. While Russia still is difficult, China, of course, is in a whole different class. And that's because, unlike the Cold War, China is deeply intertwined in the global economy in a way the Soviet Union never was. So they pose a certain amount of geopolitical threat. I'll refer you to my boss's recent speeches on this subject at the Wilson Center, or his earlier one that he's done on China. But I don't need to recapitulate all of those. But for this industry, I point out that in China, the increasing role of commercial activities, or state-sponsored enterprise, or quasi-commercial activities, is really quite striking. And I think there's been a little bit of myopia on the part of our own community, where we think that we have some special lock on cool billionaires and commercial space and entrepreneur and so forth. They have billionaires there too, not as cool as ours, but they have billionaires there too. And they have companies that are very, very aggressive. So if you look at launch, if you look at remote sensing, if you look at satellite communications, they are every bit as looking to participate in this global economy as we are, but from a very, very different place in terms of the state-owned enterprises and partially supported enterprises, in terms of the protected home market, and in terms of the integration of their foreign policy supports for that activity. A couple of examples. China Rocket Company is a unit of the state-owned China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, i.e. the PLA, will launch test flights for the next 2 rockets of its Smart Dragon series. Numbers 2 and 3 are meant for commercial use in 2020, 2021, so pretty soon. The firm's first reusable rocket, Smart Dragon 1, delivered 3 satellites into orbit just a few months ago. iSpace, which by the way is also the name of a Japanese company, but never mind intellectual property. iSpace became the first private Chinese firm to deliver a satellite into orbit, and since last year 2 other startups have attempted to launch satellites but failed. These are just a few examples in this area. We give dozens of others. And I think we can all agree we need to get our act together sort of rather quickly. This is not something that's isolated to the military community. It's also something which is a deep challenge to our own commercial communities. And now to that end, the National Space Council has prioritized development of policies at this interface of public and private sector interests. And these include regulatory reforms, new space technologies, policies on space traffic management, and ensuring there are opportunities for private enterprise greater than ever before. And we know that economies with supportive regulatory environments attract investments and jobs, and this is also true for the space economy. Now, these emerging commercial ventures, whether it's space tourism, satellite servicing, debris removal, in-space manufacturing, these will also need new enabling regulations. So it's not just removing regulations, but creating the right supportive environment for these new activities. And we look at small satellites, large constellations of satellites are increasingly outpacing efforts to develop and implement government policies and processes. So when I came in, I did not actually think that space traffic management would be one of the primary things I took on, but that changed rather rapidly as we took a look at what was going on. So after Space Policy Directive 2, we did number 3, Space Policy Directive 3, with our focus on our friends at the Commerce Department and taking over some activities that previously DoD has done. I'm glad to see has gotten not only a positive reaction in the U.S., but also positive reaction overseas. Now, that doesn't mean everybody is thrilled with it, but it does mean everybody is reacting to it. So we are setting the agenda, and we are driving the debate internationally as well as here at home. And I think that's, again, what a leader does, is you set the terms of the debate. You don't necessarily dictate, but you're the one who is really providing the ideas, providing the responses, just as we did for many, many years through ICAO and the international civil aviation community. It's really our responsibility and stewardship as a leader to drive it for everyone else so that the entire global world community can prosper. So we're pursuing these legal and regulatory regimes that promote common values shared with our partners, secure our national interests, and enable commercial sector leadership and growth in space. We believe government has an essential role in establishing this future. We want to see us being a patron of R&D, doing those things that don't really make economic sense in the near term in terms of basic scientific research, creating this conducive regulatory environment, being a customer and a consumer, not just a provider of solutions, being an anchor tenant, if we can, for national needs, and a strategic partner and coordinator. And by coordinator, I mean not trying to have industrial policy or master industry, but to make sure the different parts of the government, such as our diplomatic activities at state, defense, commerce, regulatory activities, all operate with a common awareness that these things all contribute to national power and contribute to national interests in space. So space is not something that's isolated to whatever it is NASA does and whatever it is DoD does that we don't talk about, but it's really what we as a society do in space. And so government's role is to make sure that it doesn't get in the way in that and it facilitates that, which is what you would think a free democracy would do. I'll close with a final quote, again, never bad to quote your boss, that under the President's leadership, we've unleashed American commercial space industry as never before. It was doing well before, it's doing even better now. And we've taken steps to make it possible for American entrepreneurs to invest and help America develop the technology that will carry American leadership into space. And this is important not only for fundamental national interest, but also it's important for our values. We know there will be others in space. They won't necessarily share our values. That's fine. They'll participate in space. But we want to make sure that the values that we prize in democracy, rule of law, human rights, and all that, that is intrinsically part of what you all are doing today, is making sure that there's opportunities and a possibility that our values will be part of this great new frontier. So with that, thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Some of the topics that we were talking about today, accommodating the airspace, collaboration, working together, and this is one of the first times where the aviation community and the space community are really kind of coming together under the same umbrella. What kind of advice or insight do you have on this moving forward? You highlighted really well on the Space Policy Directive with the FAA on streamlining, but how can we? How do you envision us, working together with this, congested environment that we're facing?
Well, first of all, as I was walking outside, of course, recovering academic, so I pick up paper, but simply this white paper. Okay, so first of all, that the Airline Pilots Association got together to write a paper on safe integration, and I look in the first couple pages, and I say, well, current operations are accommodation, not integration. I'm like, yep, that sounds right. And what I've learned in sort of the regulatory process, that one of the best ways to really shape the future is to create your own. Don't depend on someone else doing it. Our government is largely a self-government government, meaning that if you come together within the community itself to decide what you want to be able to do, and then you go in and actively engage the stakeholders, including the folks that you share the airspace with, and they become part of the solution. As a government guy, my life is much easier. It is much easier. When I was at Commerce, if I had an individual company coming in, say, for a new industry, and back then it was the GPS industry, one of the first pieces of advice I said is, well, who are your other competitors, and can you form a trade association? Because I'm not smart enough to understand all of your competitive strategies with respect to each other, nor do I want to try to guess that. I want you to go together and come up and say, what are your common sets of interests for as well? And so you can be really intense competitors, but when you come into the government, you need to figure out what is your common set of interests and come together on that, because that's going to be much, much more likely to be adopted, as opposed to, say, somebody wins everything they want and somebody else loses everything. That may work fine in the marketplace. It doesn't work sort of in government. So the fact that the two major communities here, growing space community, growing an important aircraft aviation community, comes together to actually want to have this meeting, come up together with common positions. You've increased your chances of success markedly already. So I always thought it was great to have aircraft people, aviation people on ComStack, and I'm glad you're doing this, meeting here today. And a lot of some of these details, such as, frequency management, for safety purposes, better awareness of things that are flying around. A lot of times when I'll hear discussions about congestion around spaceports, and Denver comes to mind, a lot of what it comes down to is actually lack of precision information, and therefore you have to have really bigger margins to work with that. It's like, bad analogy, but I'm king of bad analogies. It's like standing next to a cliff. If it's daytime and you know exactly where that cliff edge is, you can stand there all day. If it's nighttime and you don't know where that cliff edge is, you're going to want a lot of margin. You're going to want to back away from that. So the kinds of conservative rules and things that we put in necessarily for safety are a direct reflection of our ignorance. So, for example, in the area of space situational awareness, I can put error bubbles around various satellites, and if I don't have a good SSA system, those error bubbles are not only big, they get bigger over time, and I have to really make sure I can't have those bubbles connect with each other. If I have a better SSA system, I can shrink those bubbles down, and I can pack a lot more in there and do so safely, because I know how close to the edge I'm having. So the degree to which we can get better SSA systems, the better we can get better radar and tracking systems, and we know exactly where and when these things are going. And that if something goes bad, what the envelope is for that badness, how bad can things get before we have to shut down. That becomes the common problem and therefore the common solution. So to the degree that you come out of this, you also come up with ways for improving the infrastructure for both space and aviation to provide more precise knowledge so that when we draw the margins and we put in the safety guidelines, we actually have data upon which to do that with. So this collaboration to me is the first step toward that.
Scott, I highlighted earlier today in my remarks just the great leadership that we have gotten from the White House on space issues, and whether it be on the regulatory thing or the return to the moon to Mars, but it's really a global vision, a global leadership that has been put forward. One of the areas I know that you've been engaged on and very from an intellectual level, is the UN's long-term sustainability guidelines. Can you talk about that a little bit on what you've been doing and kind of the vision there?
Sure. Yeah, nothing makes, I think, maybe industry more nervous than hearing there's a meeting in the UN to discuss regulating the private space industry.
Right.
Yeah, I'm here to help you. I'm from the UN. I'm here to help you. No. So first of all, that actually, I think, did work out very well. There were 21 guidelines on sustainable space activity, a lot dealing with orbital debris, some dealing with regulatory issues, like if you're going to regulate an industry, please talk to them first. If you're going to do something, have different parts of your government talk to each other. I mean, very, very basic kinds of things. But on the other hand, this was really the first time the UN had come together and adopted on a consensus basis, and I mean consensus, that here are some basic guidelines for making sure that we can sustain space activities going forward in the future. So that was as much I think, a political achievement as well as a technical achievement. It built upon work that was done on orbital debris mitigation in the technical community. And what we did is we took best practices that had already come kind of bottom up from industry, and we brought them into the UN system. You do not want the UN system doing technical work, believe me. What you do want them to do is you want to bring in technical expertise that had been established in industry, where a consensus had been made, again, with everybody talking with each other, and then getting other countries to understand what that was, why it was, what was in their interest, to produce really capacity building for better multilateral understanding. And with that, you can get toward consensus. And when we get that consensus, we can then turn back and say, okay, we're looking at now adopting these voluntary, non-binding, not treaty, guidelines into national law and regulation. So you always preserve sovereignty with the nation state, but that doesn't mean you ignore other countries. In fact, you actively do want to engage in them. Well, we don't have sovereignty in outer space. We own our own objects and what we do, but we don't own space. We don't plant a flag and claim territory. But if we're going to operate there where we're very dependent, we have to get other people to voluntarily align with us. They have to voluntarily go, yep, that's a way we should work. We want to do it that way. We decide to join with you in that way. So again, you have to lead. And so one of our great strengths, which I think the LTS guidelines demonstrated, is that the U.S. Industry and U.S. technical community and scientific communities and government coming together, producing best practices, engaging with other technical experts, then we then come into the UN. It takes time, and it's sometimes, it's pretty hard grinding, but that you get a consensus that then can become politically adopted in other countries who do not have the depth of expertise in space that we enjoy, are able to then say, okay, it went through a process, I can trust this, this is not just something that one country or one company made up, I trust where this comes from, and you really elevate the whole discussion and the engagement of other countries, which I think, again, contributes to U.S. leadership, contributes to a better environment in which we can operate.
That's awesome. I could kind of selfishly take the floor all day asking these questions, but one I want to defer to my partner in crime here, Captain Joe DePete, the president of ALPA, and thank him for co-hosting this. But Joe, do you have any questions of Scott?
No, I'm good. I spoke to her earlier on, but I'd ask that, what do you think the biggest hurdles are presently to continue to move this down? This is our first step to really try to work together and focus on collaborative efforts to try to see what the low-hanging fruit is.
Mm-hmm.
But the frustration really right now is the lack of, we believe that right now there are tools available, thank you. There are tools available that we can be using right now to more dynamically manage the airspace,
Mm-hmm.
and it becomes a resource issue for the FAA. So we're kind of between a rock and a hard place on some of that.
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that come to mind, before one goes for a line item in a budget, one wants to have maybe a pilot program or a demonstration, area. And I don't have an answer in mind, but I would look, are there areas of the country, such as, I don't know, Alaska or up around Wallops or something, that are not, major frequent launch sites, but again, our launch sites do have operations going on where one can pilot certain activities to say, okay, how does this work? How does it demonstrate? Work out the operational procedures. So start with a tabletop exercise and then go to look at kind of like a field demo. How does this work? Who communicates with who? How does that work? Do people feel comfortable with the kind of the margins that were there? You don't want to mess with something really large like, traffic on the East Coast or something until you're more comfortable. So the first thing I would say after you had maybe a philosophical agreement on where you maybe wanted to go, say, where's the first example of actual evidence that we can get that this thing would work in an operational stand? And so hunting for areas where that might be done as a pilot of some sort, that's what I would encourage you to try to find.
Okay, thank you. We've been trying to focus on the Next Gen Advisory Committee. There are tools available today, like space-based ADS-B, for instance, that might be able to be used for more actively managing the airspace, because now we know precisely where the aircraft are, and air traffic controllers will have a better ability to be able to move things around. But it's just the slow implementation, I think, has been the problem in many cases.
Yeah. Well, and again, this is not any secret to anybody in this room, but within FAA, our ATO colleagues have their hands full. I mean, they're looking at unmanned air vehicles, other things stressing the system, trying to make that transition. So, in some ways, I think the launch guys are looked upon as a little bit of a boutique operation. Right. It's like, really, I'm going to have to worry about that. I got other bigger things to worry about. But the reality is these things are very, very visible. An accident in this area would be really visible, and in ways that I don't think people outside the space community always quite appreciate till it happens. And there's also there's an advantage in that the space community is, in fact, very technically comfortable. It's comfortable working on new and innovative things. So you couldn't find, I think, a better partner, I think, in the space launch community who's willing to experiment. Has an incentive to want to experiment and maybe demonstrate things like ADS-B in space and other techniques, maybe out ahead of maybe other parts of the aviation community would be willing to. So you might be able to do some of those pilot programs more faster with some of the space launch folks who have an incentive to demonstrate goodness.
Thank you.
Scott, thank you so much.